And now we are live, and this is Scott Seaton. I am here today with composer Libby Larsen, and this is another version of Just Ask that we are doing. And it's a pleasure to be able to continue something that we used to do during our concert intermissions, to transfer it to a virtual format. And it's allowed us to have a lot of great conversations with a lot of people in the arts arena, and talk about especially what's happening now, what's going on in the future, and to field questions from anyone who's tuning in and anyone who will tune in, who might have something watching this discussion after it's already happened. So, and like I said, when we had, live concerts, which I'm dying to get back to, we would have our audience submit questions during the intermission that I and my soloist typically would come out and just have a casual chat with the audience. And since we don't have an audience now, we have just a conversation among artists. So Libby, it's such a pleasure to be chatting with you today. And you have done so much in the field of composition over the years, and I've been aware of your work for quite a while now. But looking through your website and YouTube and all of that, your work goes far beyond my knowledge of your work. So I for example, I'm sure even now you've written more than 500 works. I mean, do you have a number?
Yeah. It's probably coming closer to 600.
That's what I figured. You are a very busy musician over there.
I live and breathe music. I love it.
And you've written, as far as I can tell, you've written across the board. I've seen works for orchestra, for chorus, for band, wind ensemble, chamber works, solo works. Have I left anything out?
Did you say choir?
Yep, choir. I mean, is there anything, let's put it this way. Is there anything you haven't done or don't want to do?
In the area of classical instruments,
Mm-hmm.
I have tried to write a solo etude for each classical instrument, and then work as much as I can within the genres where classical musicians work. I haven't worked much in rock and roll, but I love rock and roll. But really, my sphere is really acoustic instruments. Mm-hmm. And great performers of acoustic instruments. It's an infinitely joyous playground, and I'll continue to write in that genre as much as I can for as long as I can.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Oh, I mean, and you can certainly tell that element of fun is in a lot of your works that I've listened to, especially the one that we premiered a few years ago, which we'll talk about. Yeah. But backtrack for the moment, because we have some time. We could actually get to know you in not such a oppressed concert circumstance. So tell us how you began in music. What was your first musical sort of awakening?
Well, in retrospect, I realized that I had a really good fortune in that my awakening in music was when I was very young. Mm-hmm. I was 4 and 5 years old. And
oh, really?
Yeah, the good fortune was that when I was 4 years old, I went to kindergarten. Actually, my mother decided I needed to get out of the house, so I went to kindergarten and had what I know now is the good fortune of my kindergarten teacher was Miss Yamamoto. She was Hawaiian. She had just come over from Hawaii, and this was her first year teaching kindergartners. Mm. And so she taught us, besides just basic, cutting and pasting and, all the beautiful things, stringing beads on yarn, those things.
Right.
She taught us the hula.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I know. Wow is right. And it wasn't just the hula, it was the spiritual. The hula itself is a deeply spiritual ecology. Mm-hmm. And so she, can you imagine teaching this room full of 4 and 5-year-olds? We learned how to, the beauty of the hands, the waves, the fish, the sun rising. We learned, and we did quite often hula. Uh, uh, but then in first grade, I transferred to a Catholic school in the early 1950s, which was my age, and in that particular school was the teachers in that school were the Sisters of Saint Joseph of Carondelet, which is a very refined order of nuns, came from France over to settle all of the St. Mary's colleges all over the country. But my first grade teacher was nearing the end of her teaching service as a nun. And she looked to me at that time, she looked like she was 92. But to a 5-year-old, who knows? But she taught everyone in my first grade class how to read and write music.
Really?
Not necessarily to perform it, not for 3 or 4 years later when we all sang all the Gregorian chant. But we learned to read and write music using a solfege as a discipline of the educated mind. And I still have friends from first grade, and we're kind of a secret society together because we realize now what good fortune that was. We could all read music for the rest of our lives.
Wow.
So that really opened me up, which was your question. So I was kind of ready to receive anything musical. Plus I loved it. And I also have an aptitude for it, which is the gift. You have, I have, but I got that aptitude was fed properly in very early years, so that by the time I was 6 years old and started to play the piano, I could already read music. And so just the whole ecology of 1,000 years of evolution of music, I had all the foundations for. And what a lucky kid I was. Really lucky.
Where did you grow up?
Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you've been there a long time then.
Yes, a very long time.
And remind me, where did you go to school? I assumed you moved away at least a little while here and there.
Oddly enough, I went to grade school, high school, and college in Minnesota.
Oh, you did?
Yep. So I went to the University of Minnesota, and for many reasons. One being that that's where all of my sisters had to go. That was the family rule. It didn't matter where you wanted to go. You went to the university, so I did. Another good fortune is the music department at that point, which was I entered in '68, was terrific. They had 4 composers on staff. It was just blossoming and blooming. So I went to the University of Minnesota for my undergrad, thinking I would be a singer. When I began studying, my sophomore year, I thought if I'm going to be a singer, I can't stay at the University of Minnesota. I have to go to New York. And so I auditioned at Juilliard and at Mannes. And was rejected from Juilliard and accepted at Mannes. And I also auditioned at Oberlin. And it was my audition at Oberlin that cemented my path as a composer.
Oberlin, okay.
Oberlin, because I auditioned there, and went through the whole system, which at that time, you sang for the vocal faculty. And you took a series of exams, the aptitude exams for musicianship, and so I did all that. And one of the aptitude exams that they had then, I don't know if they still do now, was music analysis. And they gave me a Beethoven piano sonata to analyze, and so I took out my analyzation kit of colored pencils, and this is a sophomore in college, because I'd love to analyze music, and I'd been doing it all through high school. and I analyzed the Beethoven Piano Sonata. So on the exit interview at Oberlin, they were very good. They're very honest. They said, you could probably come here as a singer. You might have a career in commercial music, or chorister. That's the instrument you got is not for the Metropolitan Opera. That, however, it looks like you have a real aptitude for analysis and theory and composition. So they advised me to go that route.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and my heart was broken. I went back to Minnesota with my tail between my legs, thinking, I'll never be a musician. I'll never be a singer.
How did piano play into all of this at all? Or, I mean, what would you have considered piano your primary instrument, or?
Yes, and I still do, because I took 15 years of lessons, but just didn't pursue it as my instrument. I pursued voice as my instrument. At 17 years old, and unless you really have good mentors, life can be pretty funny.
Yeah.
Years of piano, but I want to be an opera singer. And then was steered into composition, which I'd been doing since I was 5 years old, but hadn't really even noticed it, because that's what I did. Was just write music. Yeah, exactly. Everybody did.
For those of you joining us, I'm here with composer Libby Larsen, and because this segment is called Just Ask, whenever through the chat, if you have any questions for us, feel free to interject, and we will get to your question. And don't be bashful. If there's anything that you want to ask her, please feel free to shoot it in the chat, and we will definitely get to it. So in all of this early process of your musical life, would you say that you obviously you spoke very highly of your your kindergarten experiences, et cetera, but would you say there was like a defining moment for you, or was it just a collection of experiences that led you to where you are now?
Well, there was a defining moment. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was in high school. I also loved economics and math. And
me too.
Yes, good, isn't it? I still do. I love it, but I just practice it in sound instead of numbers. It was 1967. There was an institute, a summer institute in the Twin Cities, and it was something to do. And so I thought, okay, I'll do something. So I applied to the institute. My first choice was economics. There was a professor from the university who was teaching economics. My second choice was music. I didn't know what that meant. And I didn't get my first choice. In fact, no girls got accepted to economics in 1967. Hard to believe, isn't it? And so I took music, and had the good fortune of meeting William Lydell, who was teaching that course that summer. He was a concert pianist, who studied at Juilliard. He also was an extraordinarily gifted jazz pianist, and the course was Paul Hindemith Music Theory.
Oh wow!
I had no idea. It was just listed as music. And so I was hooked after taking that class. And I remember you asked if there was a moment, and I know what it was. We were studying Hindemith, and I got it right away. I totally understood what Hindemith was talking about, but I'd never been introduced to the spiral of fifths. I knew about the circle of fifths, but I didn't know about the spiral of fifths, which is physics. That's the physical truth. And the way that William Lydell described it, I felt like I was living inside of it. And I knew that's where I wanted to live my life. Yeah, wow. Somewhere inside that physical beauty. And that turns out that's music. Yeah. So that was it. but I still didn't know I was a composer, even though I was.
So going back to this time period, I assumed, like any musician, you were listening to everything, not just classical music, but
Yeah.
and obviously that's deeply embedded in your music. Your music is, a lot of your music has a very deep rhythmic sense to it.
Yeah.
But what do you have, like a set of composers that maybe from the classical realm that have influenced you and how you write?
Yeah. Yeah. And 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 the truth is that I have a love-hate relationship with each one of these. Um, uh, 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 Berlioz is the first one that always comes to my mind,
Mhm.
and into my studio when I'm working. Uh, uh, he was such a maverick in his time. It doesn't sound like it now, but then he was such a maverick.
Mhm.
He would just place a sound in the air and let it hang there.
Yeah.
He played with the air and the acoustics of the orchestra in the most imaginative ways, and has has an extraordinarily original voice. And I think I like to good music is whatever's in the air.
Yeah.
That's my job, is to make it stay there, and it's my job to help you, the conductor, hear it that way. But Berlioz, he just was fearless.
Plus, he was one of the first to write for saxophone, so I admire that about Berlioz.
That's right. That's right. He was. Yes. Yeah. He understood what saxophone was, and he launched. Really launched it.
Oh yeah, in its infancy, he took a chance and programmed it, a fair amount. So I'm happy that was done and sort of paved the way for other composers to do similar things.
Yeah, and do you know? I'm going to ask you a question now.
Please.
This is about Berlioz and Adolphe Sax. Do you know if they knew each other or conversed?
I believe they did.
Aha.
I believe they did. I want to say I even read this somewhere in the past couple months about that relationship.
Yeah.
But I'm almost certain that they had a working relationship and that there were some consultations back and forth even during that process.
That wouldn't surprise me, just because you're right. Yeah, Berlioz really understood how instruments work.
Yeah.
And wrote really well for the instruments. And in doing that, created an extraordinary sense of orchestration that just isn't like anybody else's, of that period. And nor did it actually lead to anywhere else.
It was very unique, and there's some very iconic works, and just the way some of his textures sound. Whenever I think of Berlioz, obviously there's the Symphonie Fantastique.
Yeah.
One of the pieces that I really love, because when it's done well, it's some of the most unique orchestration, and I'm not even sure why, but that's Harold in Italy. And I think it's the way he writes for the brass, and they always sound kind of distant somewhere. And I'm not sure how he does that, but I've always been fascinated with him as a composer as a whole, and I'm glad that he sort of affected you in the same way.
Oh, very much so, very much so. Now I have to go reread the score to Harold in Italy with what you said in mind to figure out how he did that, because it's true. There is this sense of distance.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure he just didn't write Lontano, right?
So Berlioz and what other ones are we going to discover about?
Love Hate. This is Love Hate, and it truly is, and it's Mozart.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, and it is. Let's see. I think in music, so like I'm running through symphonies in my head and just think, but he seems so glib, and yet he's not. There's his extraordinary gift for proportion
Mhm.
in architecture. Yeah, in his music is what I most admire. Is that he knows. With me, I never get the sense that he's intellectualizing
Mhm.
about developing some music or spinning it out or coming to a cadence.
Right.
I just never have that sense. When I hear his music, one of the ways that I analyze his music um, uh, is with a stopwatch.
Really?
Yep, I do. And I started doing it in grad school with the magic flute because one of my professors, Eric Stokes, may he rest in peace, was a brilliant, very radical kind of mind.
Mhm.
He walked up to me one day in the hall with piercing blue eyes, and he never said my name. He just looked me in the eyes and he said, "You want to know Mozart? Use a stopwatch." And then and I took a stopwatch to the magic flute and started timing just to see what I could get.
Mhm.
Um, and um, and by George, if Mozart wasn't, he constructs his ideas and his phrases, it both in the micro and the macro in what was then, so that would be in the 1970s and 80s, commercial timing.
Mhm. Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah.
See, I thought you were gonna lead somewhere like Bartok and the Golden Ratio or something like that, but that's really interesting.
Commercial timing of that was at work, especially especially in television and media in the 70s and 80s in
Mhm.
particular. So 15 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute and 30 seconds. A pop song was 3 minutes. 3 minutes and 12 seconds. Mozart.
Right.
And then 3 + 3 + 3, and then you get 9 minutes, and I don't know if anybody's ever written about it, and it's but I learned so much about proportion from analyzing Mozart that way. He
Interesting.
still makes me mad though, because because he's so good at it. So
Yeah.
that's me competing. I love it. And then lately, I've been madly in love for the first time in my life
Mhm.
with Bach.
Really?
Yeah, for the first time in my life. Uh, I was never attracted to Bach, to his music, or
Mhm.
I couldn't find it. But it may be just the chaos of the times we live in. Yeah,
Mhm.
which this could lead us into 5 hours of talking with each other. But time has become infinitely fluid
Yep.
in our culture. Communication is fluid, distance is fluid, everything's fluid
Mhm.
in the culture. And in unsettling times, it's really unsettling.
Right.
And in settling times, we can roll like a river, but we're not rolling like a river right now uh, as a human race. Uh, and so, and then, and when I listen to Bach, I hear his sense of order in in a way that I never heard it before.
Mhm.
There's something very comforting about it, and there's something very real about it. And I think it's because it has to do with Pythagorean theory, and that. Uh, and I'm sure many of our listeners just went, "What tilt?" Did you say Pythagoras? And yeah, and I did. There's something a kind of natural physics at work in his music that gives me a sense of comfort right now.
And maybe this even goes back to my previous comments. Somehow that golden ratio aspect, that natural progression of the architecture, that the moments peak where we peak. It's almost like we're connected to the music in some deeper way than composers who came after him. And I feel that. I know what you're talking about. It's really interesting to try to analyze that and figure out why.
And can you feel it too? Where we get connected, it feels this
Yeah,
feels. It
yeah,
doesn't. I know it feels
and
truthful.
that's exactly right. And for me, I came on much later to Bach as well, and um, as a music student, bachelor's and master's student, I played a lot of Bach on saxophone, which, could be blasphemous, but, nonetheless, it was done. And I always, just these moments in some of the cello suites where just the writing gets, it starts out really low and then deep, dark registers. And then just these moments where it's just sustaining this tone through all these high things. And then it arrives at these incredible climaxes followed by these pauses where everything just breathes again. I mean, it's profound music. And I wish that we had a lot more orchestral music to play with in the realm of Bach, because I think
you could do transcriptions.
Oh, and we do. But even transcriptions don't come quite near the original. But
no, because he was playing on an organ. It exists in air. It exists because of the air around it.
Right. I have to ask, because I was listening recently to one of your pieces for orchestra, your deep summer music.
Oh, yeah.
And I have to ask if one of your love-hate composers might be Jean Sibelius.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Because I do hear, like I said, you definitely have that rhythmic element, but sometimes you have that sort of spacious, the music just breathes element, and that's for me 100% Sibelius. I mean, I'm deeply. I remember the first moment I heard, his music and his Fifth Symphony, and the way that he writes so horizontally a lot of the times and just connects things seamlessly is what I heard in that piece of yours. And I was like, wow, this is, it's great. I obviously loved it a lot. So it's, I didn't know if you.
Right. And it's not Bach. It's constructed in a way where there's really no cadences. I mean, there are moments, there are cadential feeling moments, but it's meant to reveal layers of horizon.
And that's so true. And even in the music of Sibelius, he, whether or not he liked to admit it, and usually he didn't like to admit it, he was deeply impacted by the music of Wagner. And and he even wrote an opera in the style of Wagner and destroyed it just to see if he could do it. But you do have that sense in Sibelius's writing that he will delay this sense of arrival for as long as possible, and just leave you hanging, and not in the same way as Wagner. It's very Sibelius the way he does it, but that element of not giving you that sense of home for as long as possible definitely comes from, oh wow, and especially the string writing, which is so minimalistic, textural, just kind of providing this padding. Yeah, exactly. You can see that, and
there isn't the Germanic the Germanic what can I say? But the romantic line, a Germanic romantic line, that's not part of Sibelius's music. So he leaves you hanging, but it doesn't take you like up there and
right. Well, before we touch on other things, were there any other composers you wanted to mention?
Oh yeah, yes, because you mentioned, and I agreed. That I listened to a lot of music when I was. I listened to a lot of music all the time, actually. And so in the classical realm, we were just talking about Mozart and Berlioz and Bartok and and Prokofiev and the Russians, and but I listened to I always Chuck Berry. I was really sad when Chuck Berry passed away, and I was just listening to John Lee Hooker last night. And early rock and roll, stride boogie piano. Louis Armstrong is one of my heroes. So a great deal of music that's evolved out of the America that we live in. I'm really interested in how we musicalize ourselves.
All right.
And most of that resides in gospel and rock and roll and and boogie and hip hop now, and whatever music we use to express ourselves, I'm interested in.
Right. And going off a tangent on what you just said, because your background especially is so diverse, going to the piece the North State Symphony did recently in 2017. So Dancing Man Rhapsody was a piece written for Terry Bohn, correct?
Yeah.
And it was co-commissioned between the Eureka Symphony and North State and maybe one other, or?
Yes.
Anyway, I just remember Eureka, but it's a really cool piece, and I don't have the score anymore, unfortunately, because it was I believe a rental. But
I'll send you one.
But one of my favorite moments from it was where you wrote a sudden conga. It's just so this is a piece that has let's see. Movement titles that are let's see. A sudden conga is your sort of second sort of section, your second movement. Remind us what the other portions of that are. And I wanted to bring up this piece specifically because you heavily utilize the quote in this piece, and I love it. There's everything from I think chopsticks in there. I think you threw in some cravats, some it's chock full of things, and for the listener who has such a diverse background, you could hear those audible laughs from the audience during the piece, which I thought was great.
Which I built into it. It's almost as if I wanted the audience. I hoped that the audience would feel that Terry was their dance partner, and their leader, and we were dancing through. The musics of the 1900s.
Yeah.
The the 1900s, because there's rag in there, and there's
a splash of Bernstein too, right?
Yep, Bernstein's in there. Yeah, and yes, so that you felt as if you had just done this wild and really crazy fun dance all the way through the history of music that has come from our culture through our hearts. And out into the air.
And I love how it starts. You have the finger snaps, and then the whole piece sort of grows and ebbs and flows from there.
Yeah.
And tell us about the final moments in the violin, if you can recall.
You mean the
crazy winding? Yeah, exactly.
Well, Terry, she's a genius.
Oh, she's great.
A genius. She's just fabulous. And she's fearless. With her, and she's alive every minute of her life. I don't know why I decided to do this, but I did it, and I asked her if it'd be all right, and she said yes. I said, I really want to move into heavy metal, and I want the end of the piece, really to be heavy metal, and of course with an orchestra and a violin, evoking what heavy is, which is that raw feeling. It's music. It's a raw music expressing raw emotion. You can't, you could say it's anger. You could say whatever it is, but it's raw, and nothing elegant about it. And she said yes, and so so I thought that's how I want to end the piece. Is just kind of a raw. It's not a Munchian scream.
All right.
It's not a barbaric yawp. It's a country that's just going like,
Nice.
And that's the ending of the piece. It's not Beethoven going the end, the really
the end.
It's the whole orchestra, and oh gosh, you did this so beautifully. Just going like and then,
well, I have a couple of minutes, and I'd like for anyone not familiar with the piece to actually hear just a small snippet of it. So, and then we can give any final thoughts on the Dancing Man. And actually, before we get into it, how did you meet Terry? How did that connection come about?
Oh, yes. Years ago, do you remember have you heard of the Bay Area Women's Philharmonic?
Oh, of course. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I met her through through them.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah, Joanne Folletta was the conductor at the time.
Mhm.
You know, we were all young, you know, and just full of vim and vigor. You know, and we all connected through the Bay Area Women's Philharmonic, and all of us have been friends since.
Gotcha. And so we're going to listen to just a couple minutes of Dancing Man Rhapsody. And the genesis of the piece, the idea came about in what year? Probably 15, 16, something there?
Yeah, it must have been. The premiere was 17?
Yes.
So it would have been 15 is
Okay.
when I'm talking about it, yeah.
Okay, well, here is Libby Larsen's Dancing Man Rhapsody. It's, I believe, a 17 or 18-minute piece, and we're going to listen to just a couple minutes, because that's all this platform allows me to upload, unfortunately. She did such a great job with that ending, and of course Terry. Anyone who knows Terry, the hair matches everything she just played. So
Wonderful.
no, it's so great. You know, it's especially the sudden conga. It always gets me every time.
Listening to it again, I was thinking, oh yes, that's right, because the right before the conga is the Bo Diddley, dun 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 dun. And we kind of get into that groove, and then all of a sudden, conga. I was in a complete state of joy writing that piece.
Mm.
It's really it's really an homage to Carl Stalling, the musical form, who is the great composer of Looney Tunes.
Right.
Who is another composer who is a hero of mine. I have all his music, believe it or not, on CDs of Carl Stalling's music, all little snippets of 20 seconds and 30 seconds, and a different form that exists in our culture.
Right, and for me, it's certainly my early life. I grew up on all of the great cartoons, so it's
Carl Stalling,
yeah,
right?
It's essential. Well, let's get to a few questions because we have a couple here. Let me back up a little bit. So let's see. First of all, we have Nina Perry. What degree it was difficult to be a woman who was a composer in the later 20th and early 21st centuries? Great question, and so relevant to everything that's going on. But in the world of classical music, especially, there's a lot of parallels between women composers and women conductors, and happily there's starting to be a lot more of both, and it's nowhere near equal yet, but it's certainly, I can imagine, a long journey. Perhaps you can tell us your thoughts pertaining to that, and backing up for you personally, how did you break into this world? How did you get your footing in such a, especially a couple decades ago, a much more harsh environment for a female composer?
Yeah, it's such a good question with 1,000 years of history as part of its answer. The system, the symphonic orchestra system. Let's just take this country, because this is where I live and work, and I've worked. The system was built around a particular repertoire, and that system includes how we train, how we think we need to program concerts, just everything. The canon, the repertoire, the invention of the radio, the dissemination of the phonograph, all those things was built around a certain repertoire. And composers who matriculated to produce music in that repertoire were part of a system that excluded females from studying. And that system still exists. It's not like we have a new system. That system has been handed down or handed through time. I don't know what to say down, just through time. And produced exactly what it produced, really until the 1940s and 50s in this country, when the AFL-CIO said women must be admitted to be performers in orchestras. Still, women who composed for the orchestra, which you can't help it. If you compose for orchestra, you do. There's no access, none at all, unless you formed your own orchestras. And there are all women's orchestras. There's a history of all women's orchestras, but it lives in the margins.
Right.
And if you define yourself in the margins, you live in the margins. And that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to stand next to you, Scott, in front of you, and have us.
Well, I want to stand next to you, so
and have us, bring our minds to the whole question, of the orchestra in our lives. So, for me, it was. I don't want to say it was lonely, but it was solitary for quite a long time, because there weren't any role models.
Right.
Plenty of male role models, but not plenty of female role models. And everyone says Mrs. H.H.A. Beach. That's not a role model. Sorry, there's a profession, and I knew that I needed to really, really know what I was doing, in order to be able to have a conversation with you, and so I knew I needed to study hard, and ask questions till I got answers, and not expect to get permission before I did something, and to expect to be a colleague.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Just expect to be a colleague, and then behave like one, but you have to write good music.
Yeah, which obviously, you wouldn't be where you are if you didn't write good music, but you have the extra hurdles of someone born differently, which
Right. Right, and receiving what I've learned is male gaze.
Yeah.
You know, especially in the 20 years or so, you know, of working in especially in orchestras, but opera is still not hospitable to heterosexual women. But in the orchestra world, male gaze was, you know, it was part of the conversation. Regularly, people would say, "You write such big music for such a little girl." You know, which means nothing, except it does mean that there's a whole set of expectations,
Right.
you
Right.
know, behind that comment that, you know, I just have to be aware of and handle yourself. I tried to handle myself graciously, to avoid anger,
Mhm.
and to stand in the middle of the road and not get out of the way.
Mhm. Do you do you feel a bond between you and say, you know, people like Joan Tower? I mean, is there like a coalition to get this music out there and do everything you can to sort of fight for to have a voice in that realm?
We know each other,
Hmm.
and we and love each other and
Hmm.
respect each other.
Oh,
And
I'm sure. Yeah.
we there's a, you know, very friendly community, you know, among women composers. There's nothing to fight.
Hmm.
Yeah, and what I mean, you know, I just finished writing. There is a cohort of young women composers in the orchestral world forming now. You know, saying, you know, who want to make a difference in
Right.
the orchestral world. And today, yesterday, I just finished writing a long kind of manifesto of, okay, if that's what you want, you know, here's what needs to happen.
Right.
You know, uh, but the fact is I hope we get a conversation going here. My question is does the orchestra world want to change?
Well, I think it has to. I mean, especially.
Why?
And that's actually a question I was going to throw back at you later on, but now that we're talking about it,
Yeah,
I mean,
I mean, I'm really serious about this.
mhm.
It doesn't have to change. It can go on becoming a repackaging industry, which is what it is. You know, until nobody wants the content anymore. But I don't see people not wanting the content.
Mhm. Yeah, it's such a diverse realm out there, and you know there are people who thrive on newness and want it, and
Yeah.
that's what I love. I love embracing that, but there are always going to people be the people who, you know, do not go to concerts unless there is the Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms.
Right.
And if there's anything else on that concert, even if that anything else is 2% of that concert, it's a lost cause. And my my mission now is to figure out how to reach those people. You know, as an artistic leader, I'm
Yeah.
trying to,
Yeah.
you know, provide balanced programs. But I mean, I think what it boils down to is, you know, we live in, you know, such a diverse world, and we have to accept that not everything is going to be our way. That some things have to be, you know,
Right.
catering to a diverse audience, and so programs and in an orchestral setting have to reflect the changing times. I mean,
Right.
look at all that's happening around us right now. How
Right.
can we not have music that's taking a snapshot of the times we live in? Because if that didn't happen, there would be no history. There
Right.
would none of
Right.
us would exist, and we'd forget about it, and then it would be cyclical, and it would happen again and again. But you know, and that's what I was going to ask you. You know, because you're sort of in an epicenter right now of
Yeah.
many different things sort of converging. And first of all, we had, you know, several months of the pandemic, which is still going on, obviously.
Yeah.
And then, you know, the events of the past few weeks. And you know, do you see yourself, and maybe you already have, at least with part of it, do you see yourself adjusting some of your writing to adapt and take in sort of this, how it's impacted you personally, maybe?
Yes.
Hmm.
Um, a couple of years ago, um, I I um, I started to write music, um, that where I can question what's going on in the culture.
Hmm.
not by quoting pieces of music in the way Dancing Man Rhapsody, which is a piece that travels through our musical lives.
Right.
But I started to write. I wrote a piece called Burn, B-U-R-N, right after the Notre Dame Cathedral.
Mhm.
I was really impacted by the Notre Dame Cathedral, in many, many ways. But to me, it was like this is Western culture, burning itself down.
Yep.
And that's the way I interpreted it, and that's the way I feel.
Mhm.
For some reason, we're burning ourselves up.
Eh,
And so I'm writing pieces that deal more profoundly with bothersome, truths in the culture,
Right.
from as authentically as I can, because I've only got my own perspective. That's really clear.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point. And this question is along these same lines. How do you find how are you still able to compose or write even during these very tense times? Well, I can imagine it's these very tense times that really push even maybe even more than peaceful times. Your impetus to compose, and even this being a Beethoven anniversary year. Look at what he wrote about.
Right.
Even if it's not expressly programmatic music a lot of times, but
Right.
he was a revolutionary,
Right.
dealing with Napoleon and all the cities being occupied around him, and
Right.
how all of that's in his music.
Yeah, it is. That's
Even
right.
though his music can be anything we want it to be, that societal impression is deeply in his music. And just like anyone who's writing now, in some way, even if they don't maybe say it in so many words, is probably going to be impacted by what's going on.
You'd hope so, and I can't not be impacted.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be authentic. And I can't. Did we have a question come up? I thought I saw one pop up.
Let me check here. A lot of comments, and some of the questions we've already addressed regarding how you compose in certain times, but
Yeah.
make sure I didn't miss anything.
Yeah, like right now I'm starting a piece for clarinet and violin.
Mhm.
And it was a commission out of the blue from Osmo Venska, who is the conductor of the Minnesota Orchestra, and he wanted a piece for himself and his wife, Erin, plays violin.
Mhm.
That's really interesting. That you want a piece for yourself as a musician, not for the orchestra, which is that's different.
Right.
I was thinking, and I think what the piece is going to be is this is a working title, is a tarantella for our times.
Mhm.
And
I like it.
Yep. And what I mean by that is, how do we dance the poison out of us?
Right.
That we're drowning in toxins, hate and chemicals, and we're drowning in poison. And
viruses and all kinds of stuff.
and that's going to be that piece.
Interesting.
Can we dance our way out of it?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what the answer is, and I don't think we need one. But I just keep thinking, if we could just stop it, just stop, and then everybody dance, move together.
Yeah, and obviously now music is more important than ever, and it's unfortunate that we have to we not only write the music, but find new ways to present the music, and we have all these challenges that we're facing currently.
It's so important now, and yet yet our outlets are all influx.
Going back to 1918, where we're talking about, music born out of circumstance and pandemics. Stravinsky wrote Soldier's Tale because he was stuck in Switzerland and needed to find an audience somewhere. And so, of course, he went to the small scale because no one's going to program Rite of Spring or Petrushka or Firebird during these times because they're just so massive.
Right.
But we're all adapting, and I'm sure you're adapting. Everyone is going to find a way to get their messages across in their music, and it in a lot of ways it's an exciting time for that because we are reinventing so much about the industry that we work in. Which is another question I wanted to ask you. Kind of on a tangent of all the barriers of a woman composer, but as a composer, do you find that sometimes you are writing to be accessible in some ways? Like, are you writing certain pieces with a certain instrumentation so that it can be played by more orchestras rather than, say, writing, I have a piece that I envisioned for 20 sledgehammers, which maybe will be performed once or twice, but how conscious are you of being accessible in that way?
That's a really complicated and really good question, which I've wrestled with. I really want to communicate as broadly as I can, given my genre, which is, finely honed in classical musicians,
Right.
But I want us to talk about our times together, and talk to audiences about our times.
Right.
And so I challenge myself to use the instruments I've got and maybe stretch what they might be able to do in order to communicate that thing. So here is a couple of examples. A piece of mine called a bid call, B-I-D call. It's an auctioneer. I wanted to see if I could translate the whole auctioneering world into a saxophone and can I use a saxophone and a cello to create an auction, and that's the surface layer. But then the next layer down is, can I create a kind of intensity where the release of a gavel, that it creates a certain kind of release, a kind of that kind of pressure to buy, pressure to do, deadline pressure.
Right.
It's part of our culture. Can I write all that into a piece in the image of American auctioneering, very different from British auctioneering. It's two instruments, that are, you have to be really, really finely trained on those instruments to play.
I'm sure.
Right. And it's a combination which you would find maybe in France and maybe in our culture, but not in, it's not common. Saxophone and cello,
right,
together. So I challenge rather than saying, okay, I want to write an auctioneering piece. Another way I could do it would be to take samples of auctioneers and create a layered piece and loop the layers.
Oh, sure.
And I mean, there's all kinds of ways to do it, but I want to do it through classical instruments and challenge the best players on those instruments.
Right.
To take up the challenge of, can we do this with our instruments?
Oh, exactly. And that's, probably part of the fun is trying to adapt, things of such different natures into, as you're saying, you like to stick with acoustic instruments and things like that. So.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
We have a question backing up Caesar. Are you a fan of Prince and his works?
Oh, yes. yes. And the studio. Yeah. I've done a couple of projects in Paisley Park. Prince is Prince. There's nobody like Prince. And
no, of course not.
I love his music and I love his mind. Yeah.
Before we wrap up today, I just wanted to ask you, because I sort of know the answer to this, but so
Well,
what are your hobbies outside of music?
yeah, I read
Hmm.
pretty voraciously. I need a lot of physical exercise because I have an abundant amount of energy. So I am a long distance runner.
That's
Uh,
right. That's
yeah,
right.
and have done that for years and years. I I love to garden.
Hmm.
Again, physical, physical energy, and you get results. Uh, Lately, I've taken up foraging, which
Really?
is really fun. Yep, to go foraging in the woods and find morels or wild ramps or garlic mustard, or and then cook. I have more time on my hands these days, so I can forage.
Anything to eat up some of the energy, huh?
Yeah, yeah, it really
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, because I think the last time we talked, because we established that we're both, distance runners, I think we even established that we've ran in the same marathon, if I'm not mistaken.
We did. Was it California?
No, in Minneapolis.
Oh, in Minneapolis. It's
Yeah,
yep.
because I've done the Twin Cities Marathon at least
Yeah,
3 or 4 times now.
we just did. Oh yeah, we probably run more than once in
Yeah.
this.
I'm looking forward to the chance that I can, get back to Minneapolis and run that amazing race between the lakes and then up the hill and
It's
finally
beautiful.
down into St. Paul, crossing the fire engine and all that stuff. It's such a great race.
It is.
Perfect time of year too. So
It is. Have you run a virtual race yet?
I haven't. I stick to just running by myself and
Yeah, yeah. I'm about to do a virtual race, and
really.
yeah, and it's because the two guys that I run with, they've both been doing them.
Oh, I see.
I'm running the 4th of July race virtually, but what that means is I can run it anytime between July 4th or July 18th.
That's great, and it sounds like the Boston Marathon because they're reformatting to a virtual race because they had moved in from April to September and then they
Yeah,
canceled September, and
yeah,
now to the people who qualified, if you can run the marathon in X amount of time between these 2 weeks,
yeah,
we'll send you the medal or something like that. And I
yeah.
thought that was really interesting, so I'm glad they're adapting.
Yep, and I'll tell you how it goes because you run it by yourself, which is strange. I mean, you pick a time. So, I picked 2 o'clock on July 5th
Yeah.
to run my race.
Hmm.
And you run it by yourself, and then you report your times,
Right.
and you get your T-shirt.
That's great.
We'll
That's great.
see. We'll
Just
see.
at your leisure.
Yeah, yeah. It's a strange way
Exactly.
to.
Well, Libby, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. I'm gonna let you go because we don't want to keep you much longer than an hour. But it's been great to retouch on and learn more about your past and all the great work you're doing now. And glad you seem to stay healthy and safe over there in
Yeah.
Minneapolis. And
You look good too, and it's really, really a pleasure to talk. Thank
oh,
you.
absolutely. And I look forward to the next time, North State Symphony or otherwise can do one of your works again. And,
Yeah.
really right now, I'm looking forward to anything we can do in any enclosed space together with an audience and just reliving something in the great realm of the orchestral repertoire. But,
Won't it be wonderful?
one day at a time.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Libby. Again, for everyone watching, thank you for joining us and for the questions. If you think of more questions, please feel free to shoot them in the chat boxes, and we will go back. And I'm sure Libby would be more than happy to come back and answer more questions. So thank you again, and we will see everyone next time. Thank you, Libby.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.